So I've been going through The Art of Thinking.
Yes.
And the first lecture is Volition as a Means to Clarity.
Yes.
And so what I've learned is that I don't think that lecture is applicable to me. I'm just going to get your thoughts on this because they discuss suppressing certain questions when you already know what their philosophical basis is and you've validated the current you've invalidated that context or philosophical context. So you know what it is and you've invalidated previously consciously. The question is generated by that context. And so you suppress it just as you would when you re-automate something like this person used to be my friend, but they're not my friend anymore. And now when I think of a movie, I need to suppress the thought of doing something with them when it comes up. But I'm not sure if that's applicable to me because unless there are other applications for this, for when you suppress questions, but from what I understood, I should be at the point in order for this method to be applicable, I should be at the point where I can explain to you why that philosophical context is wrong. But then when I think that, if I'm already at the point where I can explain why a question is based in a certain philosophical context and why it's wrong, then why would this issue even come up where you need to suppress questions? So I'm a bit unclear. Like, it doesn't seem applicable. And when it is applicable, it seems like I'm questioning why would that issue even be an issue? So
I don't really recall this bit. I'm a little confused on what the principle is here. Like means to clarity. Like what does Peikoff mean by that? Clarity to what?
So he gives the example of when he'd study with Ayn Rand on the weekend.
Yeah.
He'd have that objectivist philosophical context entrenched. And so the pragmatist context wouldn't be an issue. But then he'd go to university and suddenly he's like, well, existence exists. Is that analytic? Is that synthetic? And it's like, he'd be all confused again by the time he arrived to talk about philosophy with Ayn Rand. And he gives the example, like everyone has that issue because we come from different philosophical contexts. So you might study objectivism and you say it makes sense, but then you're like, well, who created the universe? It's just this thing that bothers you, this question. Right. Like it doesn't, where did it come from? That was what the lecture was about. And I thought, well, I can't identify what philosophical context my questions are from. And I don't, like, if you ask me to justify a virtue for you, I could very vaguely do it, or I don't even know if I could do it. But so I from what I got in that lecture, it doesn't seem applicable to me. Like that kind of method. You may not have thoughts on this because you don't remember the lecture, but
this sort of idea makes sense. I probably thought about it. I just might not know the content of the lecture specifically. So why was he saying volition as a means to clarity? Like, I get the issue and the context of the question, but clarity to understand where you're coming from.
Volition is a means of clarity in terms of you've got a certain philosophical context and it makes sense to you. Like, let's say existence exists, certainty, onus of proof, the arbitrary. When you look at that, you understand it, but then suddenly you get thrown off by other questions and you start doubting it. You feel all these questions come up and then you doubt the previous context. And in that situation where the questions that come up are generated by a different philosophical context.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's still automated, so it still comes up sometimes. And even though you've invalidated it, you have to suppress the questions till you get to a point where you've automated the correct philosophical context.
So volition in the sense of discerning what are appropriate questions.
Yeah, and which ones to put aside.
Well, yeah. I get that idea. Kind of thinking of, say, when you learn about objectivist philosophy in that context, say away from school, even in Peikoff's example, that he learned it from Rand, studied with her, took her ideas, went with all that. Rand is coming from her own context of her knowledge and the way she frames questions, the premises underneath them, why she asks them, things like that. You get that much. I mean,
Yeah.
then you could say, well, in Peacock's case, he had been studying philosophy in school quite a bit, and they're not operating the same context. They have different kinds of questions, different kind of assumptions, including like analytic or synthetic. That's part of the language of that style of doing philosophy, that of the context he was learning in school. That's what they talk about, analytic and synthetic, and how those apply to philosophy and so on.
Yeah.
So their frames of questioning are different. You can know that the questions, you can almost assume that if you're asking a question because, say, your professor asks, well, is it analytic or synthetic? Well, you know what arose in the new context. It's not a question Rand asked because it's not really relevant of a question, or even that frame of thinking isn't pertinent at all. Like analytic and synthetic isn't really a type of distinction that's relevant in objectivist thought. So you don't necessarily want to combine the two. Like you have to understand whether the context difference, or to understand which terms are uniquely applied to one. Just because you're asking it in one context doesn't mean it's relevant in the other. It seems more a matter of that. And if you know that it wouldn't usually be relevant to ask, is it analytic or synthetic within the context of objectivism? Like you would suppress the question in the sense that it's not relevant to your learning.
Right.
You might want to not suppress it in terms of if you want to understand where they're coming from, but you need to separate like why you're learning it. I think that's the kind of clarity he's talking about, that you need the clarity to ask the questions at the right time. You recognize and identify the different contexts you're operating under.
Right. So how would, let's say I study something and I have 50 questions. You mentioned the only way for me to recognize if, let's say, 20 of them are generated by one context would be to study other philosophers. But isn't that right?
I'm just trying to go off of what I understand this principle to be. I would question that. To me, it's more a matter of knowing what drives the question. I don't know if I like the phrase of suppressing a question. I think it's important to recognize where the question arises.
Right.
Is it arising out of, say, something Peacock asked, or is it arising because, say, your professor in a philosophy class asked it? Or say, imagine if a question came up and if you're talking with a friend, it doesn't mean that they're thinking in objectivist terms. They might be framing the question in a way that has different assumptions. Like they might assume that like you need to explain existence by a creator, like for example, or
Right.
some premise, like say that certainty is having no doubt about whatsoever about some thought, or having omniscient certainty. I mean, that's a different context, and you need to be able to identify what standards they're using for their claims, because they might say like, how do you know for sure? Like that doesn't sound like certainty. Or they might phrase those questions, and the only way to respond to it sometimes is the question is invalid or it's an arbitrary claim, things like that. Being able to pick that out, or being able to pick out like if, yeah, understanding what the frame of thinking they're using. If you don't recognize that there's a different frame of thinking, then you might have a hard time integrating. You just need to know who you're learning things from, and eventually you can integrate it to say what's consistent with each other, which have the same premises, which have different premises.
Okay. I'm that your explanation is good, but I'm confused more given what they actually said in the lecture. Because in
Yeah.
the lecture, on the one hand, Leonard was saying you can be in at 3 points when you're studying a certain philosophy. So one is you're ignorant, and so then you can speak to anyone because nothing sticks anyway and nothing confuses you. Two is you're somewhere in the middle, and that's like when you're trying to get a philosophical context, that's the worst place to be if you to have a discussion with someone else from a foreign context, because they will suck you into that context and then you'll be confused about your own context that you're trying to learn. And then the third point is outside of that, when you've completely automated one context, and so you can speak to anyone, you can have discussions, you can have arguments, you can recognize the points, like you can recognize what is the underlying philosophical context. If someone's talking about analytic synthetic dichotomy, you can recognize that underlying context. So he said that, but then so he said that, and then in part of the lecture he's saying this method is only applicable when you have certainty about one context and you can identify a question relates to a false context. But that seems to me like if you're at that point, it seems to me like you're already at the point where that third point he discussed, where you're so automated in your context that you don't have a problem speaking to someone else and not falling into a different context without being aware of it. Like, who created the universe? Or how can you be sure you're not wrong? How do you know that you know you're not wrong? And so, yeah, I mean, I guess my difficulty is just application to myself, because it seems like I'm not advanced enough to be suppressing questions, but then they seem to be,
Right.
at least what I've understood, there's two conflicting things here. One is you shouldn't be suppressing or putting aside questions unless you know their philosophical context.
Yeah, that seems to be
given what
the right
they
way to
said,
think of it.
yeah, but if you're at that point where you can identify philosophical context, I'm not unclear on why this is. Yeah. Anyway, I don't know right now, but
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that it does seem to only apply when you've attained a mastery or a clear certainty of what the context is. I would agree with that statement by Peikoff. I guess a disagreement would come in what sense should we ever suppress a question? I think when learning, it's not about suppressing the right question, but about at least recognizing when contexts are different. So if you start learning about Nietzsche, just for instance, don't start applying objectivist thinking to that. You have to like have a new frame of thinking then and recognize that Nietzsche is different. He has different assumptions, different premises. The questions he has aren't supposed to be the same.
Right.
It takes more skill then to study one for a while, the other for a while. Then you could start integrating the two. But like I guess when you're learning, it's important to distinguish what you're learning and keep that in your mind.
Yeah.
And don't suppress, but if you're trying to understand Nietzsche, then maybe at times suppress objectivist type questions just in the context of learning it until you get enough mastery that you can do a comparative analysis. Once you can get that comparison, then you might have some ideas or somebody's guiding you through it, then that might help you keep the context separated.
Yeah.
But if you're doing it on your own, for example, I think you'd want to stick to the questions of the context and try to integrate later.
It's difficult because you don't always know though what, like when you're learning something, you don't know if something is a foreign context. For example, if I'm studying objectivism, I'm like, well, how does, I'm starting and I'm going through things. I'm like, well, if someone can be wrong in any given situation and not know it in general, why does that mean you might not be wrong? Like, which I did ask you, why does that mean that someone can't maybe be wrong and not know it? Like maybe you're wrong and don't know it. And so those, you don't know, or if I ask, well, where does I don't know if where does the universe come from is a thing, but you get what I'm saying. Like I don't necessarily know what that's a different context. I'm just asking a question that I'm confused by.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I think that would be, I guess I'm thinking in terms of if you know the ideas you're evaluating, if you know where they came from.
Right.
I think that's really, the best you can do.
Right. Okay. All right, I will come back to this then at some point later because it's. I'll go through the rest of the lecture, but the rest of the series. But that first one was, don't know how
Yeah,
applicable.
I think I want to give it a listen too. I'll let you know what I think actually, because it
Yeah,
sounds like I want to review that one.
I have a transcription if you want. I can send it
I
to you
don't like
later.
transcriptions. I
Oh,
prefer to
okay.
listen actually.
Oh wow. Okay. I'm the opposite. I can't learn when I listen to an audio.
It
So
depends. For this, for Peacock, I tend to like his speaking style. For
okay.
him, others I don't like listening. But
Right.
Peacock, I like listening.
Okay. Yeah, he's funny. So root causes of errors. Am I right to say that I identified three? One is ignorance, so you just don't know, and so you could say someone makes an error. The other is contradiction, so you're holding two conflicting ideas, and you act on one of the conflicting ideas, and then you've made an error. And then so conflicting with reality. And then the other one would be a fallible memory, which I guess would be ignorance. So actually, maybe it's only just ignorance and contradiction, because ignorance could subsume fallible memory.
I would fallible memory is probably ignorance. I would
Yeah.
say so too.
So
It's a
those are
type of
the only two
ignorance.
causes, right? I can't think of anything else.
I would, as far as errors, as in innocent errors, not moral error, like aside from evasion, things like that.
Oh, but
Like
evasion is ignorance.
it would be it causes ignorance. But what
Yeah,
I'm trying
okay.
to say is that
Or contradiction, actually.
what I'm trying to do is distinguish between a mistake versus something morally wrong to do. Like you can be ignorant of a topic and you can make an error because you lack knowledge, but in the sense that if you're learning calculus, you'll make an error when you're learning it because you just, I don't, maybe there's a contradiction you have, or you're ignorant about some fact, or I mean, you're not aware of some fact or something like that. Like, I'm trying to think of errors like that versus say evasion, which is really a deliberate effort to not see the truth, for example.
So what about saying that dividing it into cognitive errors, ignorance, contradiction?
That could make
Well,
sense.
but then actually, if you have a contradiction, that would be a form of ignorance and you act on the wrong thing, right? Because if you're being moral, then it wouldn't be you'd have it, you'd be holding a contradiction, but you wouldn't be aware of it. So it'd be a form, everything comes down to ignorance then, unless it's ignorance. It's what's relevant is it caused by evasion?
Yeah, that would be mostly the thing. Like that's usually the distinction we make. Like you can make a mistake not due to evasion, and those would be more like cognitive errors. But you can make a mistake due to evasion, or you could even say ignorance could be caused either by mistakes or evasion. If it's caused by evasion, that's bad, and it's like a deliberate avoidance of the truth. While the other one is more like a lack of knowledge in some area, or um, misintegration, which isn't necessarily an evasion. Just like, oh, you made an error in your logic. Not it wasn't like a deliberate, like I hate reality, I hate the truth. Or like, oops, I didn't notice. I'll fix it. Like that kind of thing.
Okay. But the root cause. So the root cause of all errors is ignorance, but the causes, there can be different causes of ignorance. So there could be misintegration, evasion, fallible memory. There could be yeah, I did say misintegration.
Yeah.
Or just lack of, I guess there's another cause of ignorance is just ignorance. I don't know, ignorance could be its own, but it could also be caused by all the ones I've mentioned. One of them being moral, which is evasion.
Evasion would be, yeah, you don't want to evade the truth. Like ignorance could be just a way of saying, oh, you don't know all the facts about calculus. So you'll make a mistake because you're inexperienced or you're prone to making mistakes because maybe you'll forget certain principles in calculus or something. And that's not that big a deal. It's not like a deliberate thing, but it could be say you're not, your errors could be like, so you're not preparing your mind, for instance, or mental laziness could be another way to think of it. But it's not all maybe strictly evasion. Maybe mental laziness is a type of evasion. Like,
Maybe
oh, you're
what is
only
a type
thinking,
of evasion?
like mental laziness,
Oh, okay.
just not thinking it through or not caring enough to think it through.
Okay. So if I wanted to describe this, an error is caused by ignorance always. Ignorance can be its own cause, meaning like you can't get underneath that. Like, you know, if an asteroid hits Earth and you don't survive, well, your non-survival is, I guess, I don't even know if you could call it ignorance, but like, there's no action that you can take, and it's not because of anything you did or chose. It's irrelevant. So there's that kind of ignorance, like a deer standing because its eyes are trained to, a deer standing in the headlights because its eyes are trained to try, it stands still. Its programming is to keep it still while its eyes try and refocus so it can see again in the dark, but then it doesn't move.
Well, in a
And
way, I'm
so
thinking
that,
ignorance, whatever it would be to say, not know every unknowable fact, like the unknown unknowns. Like, I can't necessarily know that there's an asteroid hitting right to my house. Like, how
right,
could I possibly know? There's no
right,
expectation that I could ever know. If it happened, it's not like, I don't even know if I'd call it an error, because an error usually refers to something, some evaluation or something you're looking at. I'm not even sure that would qualify as error, even because you can't even make a mistake.
right,
It's just out of your awareness.
right.
So it would seem like errors are to do with things, at least within your awareness. And you
Okay.
might say, you might not have integrated everything completely yet. Like if you're learning calculus, maybe you still need to integrate everything together. So, because maybe that's a type of misintegration, but not because of any deliberate thing, but just because you need time to learn it.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense actually. Like,
Versus, yeah, go ahead.
I can't say, I don't know, if I get a cold, it's because of an error, because I didn't have knowledge of how to prevent colds. Like, it doesn't make sense to say I got a cold because of an error.
Yeah,
At least not as far as I'm aware. Although you could point out someone makes an error and they're not aware of it. Like if you have an
yeah,
advanced alien species and they're like, oh, that person got a cold, it was an error because he doesn't know about this gene that we can modify that prevents.
yeah,
I don't know. It's yeah, I'm getting myself caught up now in like confusions.
yeah. I'm just pointing out like the mistakes of the kind where you just need to learn more because you're not an expert in the field and you're learning from an expert. I mean, that's
Oh,
when I think of errors like that, where you could have the errors of the sort that, I don't know, I wouldn't call it an error unless you're aware of it at least, or it could be aware. Like, I don't think you could ever be aware that, I don't know, say about DNA in ancient Greece. It's not like, oh, they bred, I mean, you could say they're ignorant of DNA, but it's
yeah.
different than saying that they made an error, because that takes a lot of context to get to the idea of DNA, a lot
All
of
right.
learning.
So maybe we could say there's ignorance, which is a separate, but then error is caused by ignorance if you do have an error.
Yes, that
Okay.
makes more sense.
Ignorance can be its own thing. All right. I was thinking about shame versus guilt because I was having a discussion with my friend about it.
Yeah.
And so I looked up the definition. She said they're different. She's a therapist and she practices. And she said, at first I was confused because I was like, well, I thought shame, like if shame is she said shame is when you believe something is wrong with you, but does, and guilt is you think you've done something wrong according to some moral code, right? That would be guilt.
Yeah, perceived wrongdoing. It.
And so what is the basis for feeling your whole self is wrong? Like if it's not related to a behavior, it's like, then it wouldn't be guilt. But is there such a thing as just without getting underneath it, feeling that your whole self is wrong? I'm not sure if you see a distinction between them, but that's why I wanted to bring it up.
I think it would be like, let's think of an example of guilt. It's the guilt that you um, lied to your mom about stealing money from her wallet. You could say you feel
Yeah.
guilt about that. because you know you did it wrong and you've done it wrong to her. Say I'm guilty or I feel guilt. I feel that I've done wrong.
Yeah.
Shame seems to be similar, but when you say I'm ashamed of what I've done, it's like a step beyond guilt. I'm not sure actually. If you feel guilt, sometimes you could feel ashamed. Like your guilt is a shame.
Yeah, I've seen it used interchangeably. So I wasn't clear. I thought that I've heard different definitions. And so I argued with her, but I said, okay, actually, I don't know. Because shame, I've heard shame being used as like a lighter version of guilt, where shame is there's something wrong with you because of the way I actually don't know. This is why I was confused by it, because there is a thing of someone thinks there's something wrong with them, but I don't see how you can get to that point just magically be that way. I don't know. It's I'm not clear on this at all.
It's one of those questions almost like if you're trying to distinguish the meaning of two concepts as based on their wording. I think one way is just the OED is always, a dictionary is always the best place to start, because you're trying to distinguish, because we're not just arguing that philosophical meaning, but what do people refer to when they say it?
Well,
like it's just a language thing. Sometimes.
Let's go with original sin then, because that's what I had in mind. I did find definitions here. Like, so if you believe that you're fundamentally wrong, is that you believe that because God says so, or because you have an impulse to, like, I don't know, you have sexual thoughts, or you have, what else is there? You have a desire for money and material things. And you believe those are evil desires. And because you have them, there's something fundamentally wrong with you. You haven't done anything, but you have, just in having the desires, you're wrong. And so I don't know, how do you feel guilt that you've done something wrong about something that you are? That's confusing. Like, how does it work in Christianity with original sin? Like, you're told all desires are wrong. Desire for material wealth or sexual relationships are evil.
Yeah.
And so isn't it guilt if you have those thoughts because you've done something wrong, but the wrong is rooted in your natural self? Just seems like, I don't know. Maybe we'll skip it because I'm too confused about this.
Yeah, all I can say at the moment is that I think that requires a systematic look at it, like even starting Wikipedia and looking at it now. I mean, it seems like shame is a lot about self-consciousness, like being really aware, unpleasant and self-conscious, right, and related to being demotivated.
Right. Yeah, okay. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Shame is.
And guilt seems to be more about specifically violating a moral code. Personally, your own moral code, feeling bad about that. And I think you could feel shame sometimes, even for things you know are good. Like somebody tries to shame you for, I don't know, whatever belief it might be. I can think of, I'll say, shame you for, I don't know, believing. I'm trying to think of an example. And I think you could feel shame, even if you don't think you did something wrong.
Right.
But I'm not that sure either.
Yeah, okay. All right. You may or may not have answers to some of these questions. I read Causality versus Duty. Maybe we can skip the first one.
Yeah.
Skip this one. I think we discussed this.
Well, did you have a question about original sin? I forget if you said one in particular.
That was, well, no, because I was just confused by, if you have original sin and you believe there is something fundamentally wrong with you, then how does that work in terms of guilt? Because guilt is acting against, you made a choice and you acted against a moral code, but original sin is you are wrong, so everything you do is wrong. But then it seems to like lose all meaning. I'm confused by, if you are wrong, how can you feel guilt? Like, I don't know how that even works. How do you feel guilt if you are
Well,
wrong?
for one, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. You can feel shame and guilt, and they're similar but not identical. It's one of those things. Maybe you won't have a clear line, but yes, I agree with you that it's, how could, if everything is wrong, how can you feel guilt? Like, it's not like a wrongdoing if you just are, but in a way, I mean, that's the weird thing I think about Christian guilt, that you're you've done something wrong by your mere existence and you're guilty of it. And that seems to be, tends to correlate with shame, that if you are
Yeah.
at fault necessarily, then you're ashamed of, say, your body, or say like feel like you need to cover your skin because you feel
Yeah.
like, oh, you're a source of evil.
Right.
It's confusing, of course, because how could you say that you're wrong by nature, or that by nature you're going to do something immoral and you must make up for that? Yeah, it'll screw up your head if you get really, really into it.
I I think you reminded me, I said something like embarrassment could be a form of shame, which is a form of guilt.
Probably.
I tried to make that argument and she was telling me I was wrong. And this is where I got confused when I thought about it later. But my original line of thought was, which I lost, was which I lost in that discussion. It wasn't an argument. Which I lost was, if one of your, like, so I said to, if one of your clients is embarrassed in a social situation, one possible cause might be that they feel they should be behaving or acting a certain way, but they're unable to. And that is based on some view of how they should be, a moral code, and they're acting against it. Like, for example, they believe they should be very confident and they should be witty, and they have an image of they should be able to do this, or that's their moral code. And because they're not able to live by it, they feel guilt, which is then a form of guilt, which is shame, which is a self-consciousness, as you've described. And she didn't buy that, but that's what I thought originally. And then somehow I got taken out of that, and then I got
Yeah.
confused. But yeah, where I was confused was part original sin. Like, I thought that all shame is rooted in a form of guilt, which would make it intelligible for me, because you can be like, you can feel guilty and not be self-conscious. Like, for example, if I lie in a very trivial way, just like an automatic habitual thing, like some exaggeration, and I feel some guilt, and I'm like, that's bad. I don't want to be that. I want to change that. That's guilt. But then the shame would be, like you pointed out, when someone sees me doing something and I suddenly am guilty, and I also feel self-conscious and I feel ashamed and I want to hide it, like you pointed out.
I
But
think you could feel shame without guilt too.
okay. Yeah,
Like,
that's why I was.
I'm thinking of an example, like, say, gay people in the 60s, even, that if they were caught with another man, they'd feel shame. They might not say that I'm guilty, I'm a bad person, or I'm guilty, I've done a moral wrong, but they might feel ashamed that, like, society won't accept them, people won't like them, they won't be understood. And I think you could feel ashamed that you want to be this way. Like, it's a very self-conscious thing, I could imagine, to feel conflicted that society won't even like you anymore. I mean, to me, that sounds like what could be shame. You could be ashamed of what you are. You can be ashamed, like, without feeling guilty per se. It's very just as destructive, of course, but that's the best I can do, I think.
Right. Yeah, I'd need to think about
Yep.
that more.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
so
related to this question here about
yeah,
duty, I
it would
think.
be also like, what is the shame rooted in, would be the question in that situation for the person. Like you pointed out, they feel that they should be understood in a society, and if they're not understood, then they feel shame. But then, are there situations where you can be not understood, but it doesn't, like, you wouldn't feel shame um, in
Probably.
a society? So like, then the question, if that's true, then the question is, what is the shame rooted on?
Right.
So I don't know. It's a complicated.
And
I
it might
was
be
Yeah, I was trying to make
duty-based
it
ethics.
intelligible. That was basically where I was going. I was trying, because to me right now it's intelligible to be like, it's this thing that you're just self-conscious about. And I was like trying to trace it to guilt, so it made sense.
Yeah,
But maybe I don't know. Sorry, I cut you off. What were you saying?
it kind of relates to like duty-based ethics. Like that could be a good example of why you might feel shame, even if you've done no wrong. Not that you made a violation of the moral rule, but that you don't see your life isn't compatible with it, that you can't make decisions on the well-being of your life because the duty ethics would make it hard to live, be yourself,
But
like a conflict with self-esteem.
isn't a duty ethics a form of a moral code though? Like you pointed out, it's not against you. You're just pointing out that there are two different contradictory moral codes that a person is holding.
Yeah.
One is a duty-based one. So isn't that an argument for it's all based in guilt?
Well, then we get into like, are they compartmentalizing? I'd say probably that they're trying to live their life, but it conflicts with their other ethic, and
Right.
it is complicated, of course. But
I know.
what I'm saying, more rooted in, if we think about it in terms of duty-based ethics, then you
Yeah.
might be able to create an understanding, acknowledging even the contradictions in their own mind. I mean,
Right.
I think it would arise out of duty-based ethics much of the time.
Right.
Whatever explanation you have, I think it arises out of there somewhere.
Okay.
That's where the error came up,
But
and then
then
just build from there.
to me that's guilt. That would be because guilt is you've acted against. You could say your moral code, it's just not an integrated one. Like you pointed out, it's a
Sure.
compartmentalized, disintegrated, misintegrated. I have no idea, but one of them. And
Yeah.
so, but yeah, like you pointed out, I need to think about it more.
I mean, I think could even disagree about, it's fine to disagree about the guilt shame thing, but I think certainly you could say it goes deeper than that into some ethical code at least, or
Right.
some philosophical code. And I
Right.
think that's what it relates to. Like
Right.
whatever it is, whatever specific thing it is that makes them feel bad, we can recognize it as some philosophical principle. At least that's
Yes.
what Rand would claim
Yes.
usually.
Yeah. I think so too. I think I had an answer to this, but I forgot. And I'm just trying to remember. That was something I was going to bring up. So another thing I spoke to her about, and I did have an answer at one point, and I've just lost it. And so maybe, she was telling me that sometimes, because I remember speaking to you about philosophical premises, and then she told me that sometimes I was speaking to you about metaphysical value judgments, or I was speaking to myself about them. I can't even remember anymore, but I was speaking to either you or to myself about metaphysical value judgments. And she was saying that some people, they don't think that. So Brandon said something like one metaphysical value judgment might be happiness is impossible to man on earth.
Yep.
But she was saying that there are people who are, and this actually makes sense to me, but then I was trying to reconcile it with philosophy, like everything is rooted in a philosophical premise. So she was saying some clients say happiness, they feel that happiness is impossible to them, but not impossible to other people. But
Right.
then at first I was like, well, I thought about this later and I was like, well, wouldn't it be rooted in some explanation? How could you have a belief, or could you have a belief where happiness is impossible to you, but there's no basis for it? Like that doesn't make sense to me that you'd have that as a metaphysical, could you have that as a metaphysical value judgment that you could not get under? Would that not be rooted in some view of the universe? Like in some view of yourself, like happiness is only impossible to me, but not other humans. Like you've got some kind of metaphysical value judgment about humans in general, but just for some reason, I assume for some reason, you have a belief that it's impossible to you as an individual.
I mean, yeah, it would still be philosophical, I think. Or are you just asking what kind of premise would they have that
Yeah,
makes
like,
them so
because what would
unique?
that would be, yeah, because I was trying to, well, how could you have a metaphysical value judgment that is happiness is possible to men on earth, just not possible to me? Like, unless it's rooted in some other, like that's a secondary and not a primary.
I'm trying to think. Probably in something to do with almost thinking that a premise that you're more important than everyone, but you never attain happiness. Therefore, I'm trying to think of some way of couching it in terms of like thinking you're the most superior being or whatever exaggerated sense of value you have, like a sense of vanity rooted by thinking that your failure to attain happiness means that it's only directed at you, that there's something special about you. And sure, everybody else can, but you're special. The world revolves more around you, or it could be something like solipsism, that the only one that really matters is yourself. And sure, maybe everyone else could be happy, but that's beside the point. Can I be happy? No. It might be something like that,
Oh,
something
okay.
more
So,
primacy of consciousness oriented. What about your own consciousness? Like,
okay, I get
oh,
it.
there's all those other people, but there's me, and woe is me. I'm special, and I can't get
Ah,
happy.
oh, that's interesting. So you're saying that so sometimes it'll be something as direct as, rather than observations of nature or yourself, it'll be something as direct as some form of primacy of consciousness where you can't get underneath it. Like there's something special about you, and that the world rotates around you in some way, which is getting at a truth in some sense, but
Yes.
because it's held as an emotional thing that you cannot get underneath, meaning it's not based on any sort of observation. It's just an emotional belief. The metaphysical premise or the metaphysical value judgment would be well, I don't know if primacy of consciousness is a metaphysical value judgment, but it would be all rooted down to primacy of consciousness. That's what you're saying, which makes sense to me. Did I get
Like
that
a,
right?
yeah, that's basically it. Like a
Okay.
narcissistic way of thinking, for
Right.
lack of a better term. I don't know what other
Right.
term, but I do think that's a very real thing. That's not always like everybody is a collectivist, and it's not that they all want to be say, oh, I'm nobody can be happy. It's like putting all on themselves. Like it's not always just blaming others, and it is like seeing just yourself in a
Could
very emotional way.
could you say that what would be, so the one of the metaphysical premises is primacy of consciousness, but what would be an implicit metaphysical value judgment, which is, to me, I understood that as those are the kind of premises that bridge metaphysics and ethics, and they're your view on man, on free will, and on uh, man, free will, knowledge, man includes knowledge and all of that. So anything that has well, actually, I'm confused now because all metaphysical premises are, in a sense, metaphysical value judgments that determine your ethics, right? So I was
Sure.
trying to make a distinction between metaphysical premises and metaphysical value judgments. And then in relation to a person who says happiness is impossible to me, but not to other people.
I think the value judgment part's just when you had the me or them, or some say that's good, that's bad. I mean, a premise, which is on its own, would be like existence exists. But if you hold that or not, or you say God created existence, that I think that has some direct impact on what you will then judge about it.
Right.
Or it gets
Okay.
complicated if you, so you might think that God created the universe, but judge that he's evil because he made your existence, and existence is suffering. Therefore, God is evil. Like you can have convoluted things like that.
Could you repeat that? You could believe in God, but then,
Hate him for creating life because you think life is terrible.
oh, okay. So
Something
then,
distorted like that. Like that's a way you can get
oh, but
a distinction between the fact that you believe is true versus the judgment, which could be a little different.
okay. In your example, I would say the metaphysical value judgment is life is terrible. The metaphysical premise is God exists.
Something like that. I'm not sure what terms we should use, but that is kind of the distinction I'm making. I mean, I mentioned before I didn't really like when Rand used metaphysical value judgment always, because then it seemed like it's not just always metaphysics anyway. So I'm not entirely clear if that's even the best term.
Right.
But I think you could have a premise that doesn't necessarily say what your value judgment will be. It might inform it or make a big part of it, but doesn't necessarily determine it, because people get weird ideas sometimes.
Yeah, I was just thinking now, I guess the complication is that if you're dealing with the average person or most people and their premises are not integrated explicitly, then you might be like if that example of the person who says, I can't be happy, but other people can be, that just might be some isolated primacy of consciousness premise in some aspect, but not in all aspects. Like if you then ask them, what is your view of men in general? What is their nature? not that they'd have given that thought. They may answer something completely contradictory to what they're just saying.
Yeah, I mean, they could take something cynical. They could even say, yeah, most people are good, or something like that. I don't know.
Right. Okay. All right. I was trying to get clear on this distinction between metaphysical premises and value judgments because I didn't get them. But
yeah, I would just distinguish just on the level of you got a particular fact, but then the value judgment still is a judgment of good or bad, important things like that. That there's a value involved, not just a statement of fact.
It has, well, yeah, in a sense, every premise would have a relationship to you, but that's
yes. There's always an implication for morality, I think.
Right. Okay. So I wonder if you can you think of any other real world subtle examples of duty-based ethics playing out in people's lives, personal lives? One I thought of was should, which we discussed a couple of conversations ago, where you need to make there is, if you're looking at, if you put should in terms of is ought, then when you say to yourself ought, you ought to consider what the is, if that makes, I don't know if that makes sense to you, but that's what we got at, which was not obvious to me. And then, so that's an example of a subtle way. If someone doesn't be explicit in their, if, I should do X if Y, or I ought to do X because Y is, if someone's not explicit, they can fall into duty-based ethics unknowingly, subconsciously. So can you think of any other examples of how someone might fall into a duty-based ethics unknowingly in a subtle way?
We've done the obvious ones before. So the subtle ones.
Well, I would say should is subtle. Should was subtle to me. Like I've often told myself, I should do this. And it's not even clear, like, what is the,
That's a good example. Where else might you say? Where's the other duty-based? I've seen it a lot when people don't want to say no to something. They don't want to say it's like, oh, it's duty. It's like they have like an excuse to themselves, or they think it's important to have a relationship with a certain kind, but they still don't really want to do it. They don't even realize that they need to say no or they want to say no, but they refuse. Right. They might even recognize that they're sacrificing whatever. But I've seen that many times with people. They just don't want to say no. Even on television shows. It's like, just say no sometimes. It's not going to kill you, but that's the most obvious but subtle one that I can think of. I've seen it many times.
Okay, that's interesting. Some of that, not all of it, but some of it might be rooted in it's bad to hurt other people. And then that might be rooted in other things or not, or that could just be a duty-based. It's bad to hurt other people. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Any other examples? Nothing else is coming to mind right now.
All right. I actually, this example you gave of I'm special is really interesting. I was just thinking about that, like that. It's so true though, because think about it, like when I think about it now, I never thought about that, but it makes so much sense. If someone says, I can't be happy, but other people can be, like, so you don't have that very basic philosophical premise of life on earth is terrible and that includes every human. It's just you. And so what else, like, how else could you explain that logically other than saying there is something special about you? I don't know what is underneath that specialness, but there is some special quality you have. And the question is, what is that special quality? I never thought about that, but that if you look at it logically, that would have to be implicitly what the belief is on some level.
Yeah, I think it is. I don't have any better explanation, but or any deeper. That's the best I got. But just like I've read a lot about narcissism, and that's probably the only reason that kind of example comes to mind, because I've thought about it many times, even in characters I've written. So I've thought about it before.
Okay. Do you think I guess this is more psychology. Now I'm curious, like, I wonder if you challenge, I'm not a psychologist, so I'd actually be interested to speak to someone and understand why do you think you're like, I don't know if I'd be a very good psychologist, but asking someone like, well, what is underneath that specialness that you have? Why is happiness only impossible to you? And maybe you can't get underneath it. Maybe it's just an emotional premise and there's no underneath and that's it.
More than likely, they'd get mad at you. That's how they rebuild. Like a true narcissist will get mad for you asking, like, isn't it obvious I'm the best? Like, how could you think that I'm not special? Isn't it obvious? Like, that's kind of their reaction usually.
Right.
Or they don't even have like not even willing to consider that, yeah, maybe that they're not special. They're like anyone else. They can be as happy as anyone else.
Well,
go ahead.
Special is a funny word because you're special in relation to something. So the question is, what is special in what sense? Like it's not special as a measurement, right? Like, there's something different about this, but the question is what and in relation to what. So that's not specified. So that's why I'm saying it could just be an emotional that there's something superior about me, like you said. But there's
there's a lot of emotional grounding.
There's no getting. Yeah, I'm not sure. Like when you have an emotional belief, you could have one that's not, in a sense, it's based on observations, or it could be based on evasion. So there's no getting underneath it. It's just there and it's stubborn, right? Like you can have.
Usually, yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. The most stubborn of all psychological issues when treating somebody. It's the most difficult thing of all. A narcissistic person. Even narcissistic traits are the most difficult. But like the really bad ones, like where you think you're just superior by nature or special or unique by your very nature. That you're like beyond or separate from. But
not specified in any way, right? Like there's no specification of what kind of uniqueness or specialness.
Not usually. They say like usually be just implicit in the way they think about themselves. Yeah. Or they might say that I'm the best at some field, but it goes deeper than that. They think really on a fundamental level of their existence, they think they're superior, or even not even superior, just a unique case that no one appreciates or something.
Okay. But then that would definitely be that would be an example of one you can't get underneath. Just like, for example, maybe you could find a motivation for it, but you can't, just like you can't say, well, like, I don't know if you could get underneath someone's belief in God, for example. It would be similar, because what does it mean to be superior in an unspecified way, right?
Yeah.
So
I think that's why I went to primacy of consciousness.
Right.
Because really almost the ultimate subjectivism. Right. It just feels, they feel it. Like I'm the best, just I feel that way. Or I feel like I'm singled out of everyone.
Right. Yeah, that's interesting, because it's also, I never thought about this. I'm going to bring it up with her and see what she thinks, but it's also you're saying primacy of consciousness, but part of primacy of consciousness is from an objectivist perspective anyways, big gaps between concepts and percepts. And so look at the way look at the way the thinking is being used: best, superior, special, but it's all undefined, meaning you're using the concept in an unintelligible way. Like, superior in what way? Using what standards? Special against what? How? Best compared to what? by what metric? Like none of that is there. It's just, you're saying there's some kind of just big block. I'm special. I'm superior.
Yes. That's the
Okay.
type of thinking I'm talking about.
Wow. All right. Wonder if we've got
Those people
time.
exist.
Sorry?
But there's many ways that can arise, but a narcissist is just one type of that among others, obviously.
Right.
It's just one type.
One type compared for what? One type of
We'll
what?
say different ways of being an emotionalist.
Ah, okay. I see what you're saying. So one form of emotionalism is narcissism, which is rooted in some kind of premise of one kind of premise that if given words, even if they're unintelligible, is I'm special, I'm superior, I'm the best.
Yeah.
Okay. Cool. That's fascinating. Okay. What did I want to say about emotionalism? Kind of relevant, but we should wrap it up soon, actually. Let's